The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of George Strait's ranch in Cotulla, Texas. At 72, the king of country still rose before dawn, a habit ingrained from decades of touring and a lifetime of discipline that had carried him through both triumph and unimaginable tragedy. He stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching his prize-winning cattle graze in the distance while the familiar weight of nearly 4 decades pressed against his shoulders. "George, you ready for this morning?" Sarah Strait emerged from the house, her silver hair catching the early light. After 51 years of marriage, she could read her husband's moods like sheet music, and today she saw the familiar tension that appeared whenever he had to do interviews, a guardedness that had developed gradually over the decades, but had its roots in a loss so profound it had changed the very fabric of their family. "Just another day talking about music," George replied, his voice carrying that distinctive Texas drawl that had charmed millions. But Sarah heard what he didn't say, the careful control he maintained whenever anyone might venture too close to topics that still cut deep, even after all these years. It had been 37 years since Jennifer's accident. 37 years since their world had shifted on its axis, leaving them all struggling to find their footing in a reality that felt fundamentally wrong. Jennifer, their bright-eyed 13-year-old daughter, had been killed in a car accident in 1986, when George's career was just beginning to take off. The timing had been cruel, success and devastating loss intertwining in a way that had colored every achievement since. "You sure you don't want me to come with you to Nashville?" Sarah asked, settling beside him on the porch swing they'd installed years ago, back when they still believed in simple pleasures and uncomplicated joy. Rebecca Thompson's show is pretty straightforward. Just talking about the new album, maybe reflecting on the career. George took a sip of his coffee, black as always. "Besides, you've got that appointment with Dr. Martinez about your mother." Sarah's mother, Elena Rodriguez, had been showing signs of early-stage dementia, adding another layer of complexity to their already carefully structured lives. At 88, Elena had been a pillar of strength for the family, especially in those dark months after Jennifer's death, when George had nearly walked away from music entirely. "Marcus called last night," Sarah said carefully. Their son, now 52, had built a successful life in San Antonio as a pediatric surgeon, though the family dynamics remained complicated by the long shadow of his sister's death. "What did he want?" "Just checking in. He mentioned seeing the interview announcement online." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's concerned about you doing live television." George's jaw tightened slightly. Marcus had developed an almost protective vigilance over the years, particularly regarding his father's public appearances. The weight of being the surviving child had shaped him in ways that were both admirable and heartbreaking. He'd become a healer, dedicating his life to saving children, but he'd also become hyper-aware of every potential threat to his family's carefully maintained equilibrium. "I've been doing interviews for 50 years, Sarah. I think I can handle Rebecca Thompson." "I know you can." But Marcus worries about the unpredictability of live broadcasts. There's no editing, no second chances if someone mentions her. George's voice sharpened, though he immediately regretted the tone. "I can't spend the rest of my life avoiding her name." Sarah reached over and took his hand, feeling the calluses from decades of guitar playing and ranch work. "Nobody's asking you to avoid anything. We're just asking you to be gentle with yourself." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel as George's longtime manager, Thomas Mitchell, pulled up in his black Suburban. Thomas had been with George for over 25 years, managing everything from tour logistics to media appearances, with the efficiency of someone who understood that his client's public persona required careful cultivation and protection. "Morning, folks," Thomas called out as he approached the porch. At 61, he maintained the crisp appearance of someone who'd built his career on attention to detail and crisis management. Flights on schedule. Should have you in Nashville by 10. Plenty of time before the noon taping. Any last-minute changes to the format? George asked, standing and stretching muscles that felt the accumulated weight of decades on the road. Same as always. Rebecca will probably start with the new album, ask about the tour, maybe touch on your legacy in country music. She's got a segment where she reads fan mail, which always plays well with the audience. Nothing controversial. Thomas consulted his tablet, scrolling through notes with practiced efficiency. George nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the mention of fan mail. Jennifer had loved the letters that came to their house, back when she was alive. She'd been fascinated by the stories people shared, the way music could touch lives in ways the musicians themselves never expected. At 13, she'd had an intuitive understanding of the power of connection that had amazed her parents. The producer mentioned they've got some particularly touching letters for today's show, Thomas continued. Apparently, there's one from a young woman about how your music helped her through losing her father. Rebecca thought it would resonate with the audience. Sarah and George exchanged a look that Thomas missed, but the weight of unspoken concern hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Over the decades, they'd both developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to potential emotional triggers, though they'd learned to navigate most situations with practiced grace. An hour later, George found himself 30,000 feet above Texas, staring out the window of his private jet at the patchwork of farms and small towns below. His longtime friend and guitarist, Christopher Reynolds, sat across from him, quietly working through chord progressions on his acoustic guitar. "You nervous about today?" Christopher asked. He'd known George since the early days of his career, had been there during the darkest period after Jennifer's death, when George had seriously considered abandoning music entirely. "Should I be?" Christopher shrugged, his fingers finding familiar patterns on the strings. Live television's always unpredictable. But Rebecca Thompson's good people. She's not looking to create drama. That's what Thomas keeps saying. But George was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds drift past the window. "Sometimes I feel like I've built my entire career on avoiding certain conversations, and I don't even know what would happen if I had to have them." Christopher understood immediately. Since Jennifer's death, George had become masterful at deflecting personal questions, steering interviews towards safe topics like songwriting craft and industry changes. It wasn't deception exactly, but it was a form of emotional self-preservation that had become so automatic it was almost unconscious. "Maybe it wouldn't be the end of the world if you talked about her," Christopher suggested gently. "Keeping everything locked up for 37 years, that's got to be exhausting." "And what would I say? That I still think about her every single day? That every success feels incomplete because she's not here to see it? That I've written dozens of songs about her that will never see the light of day because I can't bear to share them?" Christopher had no easy answer for that. He'd watched his closest friend build one of the most successful careers in country music history, while carrying a grief so profound it had shaped every decision, every relationship, every moment of joy or sorrow. The plane began its descent into Nashville, and George felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had accompanied public appearances for decades. Below them, Music City spread out in all directions, the Cumberland River winding through downtown like a silver ribbon connecting past to present. Nashville held complicated memories. Jennifer had loved visiting the city during George's early recording sessions, marveling at the history and energy of Music Row. She dreamed of maybe living there someday, though at 13, her dreams had been beautifully vague and constantly changing. George had encouraged all of them, never imagining he'd spend the rest of his life wondering what she might have become. Music City Today was filmed in a restored historic building in the heart of downtown, just blocks from the Ryman Auditorium and the Country Music Hall of Fame. As George's car pulled up to the studio, he could see the familiar controlled chaos of a live television production. Crew members hurrying with equipment, security personnel managing the small crowd of fans, and the ever-present energy of Music City humming beneath it all. Rebecca Thompson met him at the door, her warm smile and firm handshake immediately putting him at ease. At 48, she'd built a reputation as one of country music's most trusted interviewers, someone who could draw out genuine stories without exploiting vulnerability. "George, thank you so much for doing this," she said, leading him through the maze of hallways toward the green room. "I know how selective you are with interviews these days." "Thomas says you've got some good fan mail to share today." "Oh, we do. Some really beautiful letters. There's one in particular that I think will touch your heart. A young woman named Jennifer Patterson from Missouri wrote about how your music helped her cope with losing her father in Afghanistan. It's incredibly moving." George stumbled slightly, the name hitting him like a physical blow. After 37 years, he'd heard the name Jennifer thousands of times. It was, after all, a common name. But something about the context, the vulnerability of the moment, the approaching live broadcast, made it land differently. "You okay?" Rebecca asked, genuine concern in her voice. "Fine, just fine." The green room was decorated with photographs of country music legends who'd appeared on the show over the years. George found himself staring at the wall, seeing faces of friends and colleagues who'd shared the journey, many of whom were now gone. The passage of time felt suddenly heavy, pressing against him with the weight of all the years that had accumulated since 1986. "Mr. Strait," a young production assistant appeared at the door, her enthusiasm barely contained. "We're ready for you in makeup." The next 30 minutes passed in the familiar routine of television preparation. Makeup to reduce glare under the studio lights, sound check to ensure his microphone was properly adjusted. Final review of the talking points with Rebecca and her producer, Daniel Webster. "The fan mail segment is our most popular feature," Daniel explained, his excitement evident. At 35, he'd grown up listening to George Strait and could barely contain his enthusiasm at having his idol on the show. "We always save the most emotional letter for the end. Today's letter from Jennifer Patterson is really special. She talks about playing your songs at her father's funeral and how your music became a bridge between her grief and healing." George felt his chest tighten. The combination of the name and the subject matter was creating a perfect storm of emotional triggers that he wasn't sure he could navigate on live television. But he'd built his career on professionalism and reliability. He couldn't back out now. "Sounds touching," he managed, his voice steady despite the turmoil building inside him. "5 minutes to air," someone called out, and George felt the familiar pre-performance energy that had sustained him through thousands of concerts and hundreds of interviews. This was just another performance, he told himself, another opportunity to share the music and connect with the fans who'd supported him through 5 decades of recording. But as he walked onto the brightly lit set, with its comfortable chairs and backdrop featuring iconic Nashville landmarks, George Strait had no idea that in less than 30 minutes, the carefully constructed emotional fortress he'd built over 37 years was about to crumble in front of millions of viewers, forever changing not just his life, but the lives of countless fans who would witness the moment when the King of Country's crown finally slipped, revealing the heartbroken father beneath. The studio lights were warm against George's face as he settled into the familiar red velvet chair across from Rebecca Thompson. The countdown from the control booth created a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. In 5, 4, 3, 2... The final count was silent, marked only by a pointing finger, and suddenly they were live, broadcasting to an audience of over 2 million viewers across the country. Good morning, Music City. I'm Rebecca Thompson, and you're watching Music City Today. We have a very special guest with us this morning, the one and only King of Country, George Strait. Rebecca's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd mastered the art of television hosting. George, thank you for joining us. Always a pleasure, Rebecca, George replied, his voice carrying that familiar ease that had made him a favorite interview subject for decades. Despite the earlier moment of unease, he felt himself settling into the comfortable rhythm of promotion and conversation. Let's start with your new album, Honky Tonk Heaven. This is your 61st studio album. How do you keep finding new things to say after all these years? George smiled, leaning back slightly in his chair. This was safe territory, the kind of question he could answer in his sleep. Well, life keeps happening, you know. As long as people are falling in love, getting their hearts broken, working hard for their families, there are going to be stories to tell. Country music has always been about real life, and real life doesn't stop giving you material. Speaking of material, I understand several tracks on this album were written by some of Nashville's newest songwriters. You've always been known for supporting emerging talent. That's right. There's so much incredible talent coming through Nashville these days. Young writers who have something to say and the skill to say it well. I've been blessed to work with some amazing songwriters over the years. Dean Dillon, Aaron Barker, Jim Lauderdale, and now there's a whole new generation carrying that tradition forward. The conversation flowed naturally through topics George had discussed countless times. His approach to selecting songs, the evolution of country music, his thoughts on the current state of the industry. Rebecca was skilled at making familiar topics feel fresh, and George found himself relaxing into the interview. Now, George, you've been touring for over 4 decades. What keeps you motivated to get up on stage night after night? The fans, George answered without hesitation. Every night you look out into that crowd and see people who've driven hours to be there, who've saved up their money for tickets, who know every word to songs you recorded 20, 30 years ago. That's humbling and energizing at the same time. Music has this incredible power to connect people, to help them through difficult times, to celebrate the good moments. Being part of that, it's a privilege. As he spoke, George caught sight of the teleprompter scrolling through the upcoming segments. His chest tightened as he saw fan mail segment listed, followed by letter from Jennifer Patterson. The name seemed to pulse on the screen, drawing his attention like a magnet. You mentioned the power of music to help people through difficult times, Rebecca continued, unaware of George's internal struggle. That actually leads perfectly into our next segment. We love sharing fan mail on the show because it really illustrates the impact that music, and specifically your music, has on people's lives. George nodded, his mouth suddenly feeling dry despite the glass of water positioned discreetly beside his chair. Fan mail has always been important to me. It reminds you why you do this. We have several wonderful letters today, but there's one in particular that I think really captures something special. Rebecca picked up a blue envelope from the side table, handling it with the care of someone who understood its emotional weight. This letter comes from Jennifer Patterson in Springfield, Missouri. The name hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, reverberating through George's consciousness with unexpected force. He felt his carefully maintained composure begin to slip, the professional mask he'd worn for decades suddenly feeling heavy and ill-fitting. Jennifer is 26 years old, Rebecca continued, unaware of the seismic shift occurring in her guest. She wrote to tell us how your music helped her through the most difficult period of her life. Would you like me to read her letter? George wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at him to deflect, to steer the conversation elsewhere, to maintain the emotional distance that had protected him for 37 years. But he was live on television, in front of cameras and a studio audience with millions of people watching. The professional obligations of nearly 5 decades in the spotlight overrode his personal discomfort. "Of course," he managed, his voice sounding normal despite the earthquake building inside his chest. Rebecca opened the envelope with practiced care, unfolding the handwritten pages with respect for their contents. "Dear Mr. Strait," she began, her voice taking on the gentle cadence she used for the most emotional fan mail segments. "My name is Jennifer Patterson, and I'm writing to tell you how your music saved my life." George felt the first crack in his emotional armor. The name, repeated in this context, was beginning to penetrate defenses he'd thought were impenetrable. "When I was 13 years old," Rebecca continued reading, "my father, Sergeant Michael Patterson, was killed by an IED in Afghanistan. He was on his 3rd deployment, and he'd promised this would be his last. He was supposed to come home for Christmas." The studio seemed to fade around George as Rebecca's voice continued. 13 years old. The same age Jennifer had been. The same age his daughter would forever remain in his memory, frozen in time by tragedy. "I was angry at everyone. God, the military, my father for leaving us, the world for being so unfair. I stopped talking to my friends, stopped caring about school, stopped caring about anything. My mother was struggling with her own grief, and our whole family was falling apart." George's hands gripped the arms of his chair as memories he'd spent decades suppressing began to surface. Jennifer at 13, full of life and possibility, her laughter echoing through their house, the phone call that had shattered everything, the funeral that had felt like the end of the world. "But then," Rebecca read on, "my aunt played me your song, 'I Cross My Heart,' and something inside me shifted. It wasn't that the song made everything better, but it reminded me that love doesn't end, even when life does. My father had loved me completely, and that love was still real, still part of me, even though he was gone." Tears were building behind George's eyes, 37 years of carefully contained grief pressing against the dam he'd built to hold it back. The studio lights seemed too bright, the air too thin. He could feel his breathing becoming shallow, his heart rate increasing. "Your music became my therapy," Rebecca continued, her own voice growing emotional as she read. "Songs like The Chair, Amarillo Morning, and Check Yes or No reminded me that there was still joy in the world, still reasons to smile, still hope for the future. When I graduated high school, I played 'I Cross My Heart' because it felt like keeping a promise to my father." The camera captured every micro-expression on George's face as the carefully constructed walls he'd built over decades began to crumble. The professional performer who could sing through any emotion, who could maintain composure in any situation, was being undone by a letter from a stranger who shared his daughter's name and had experienced loss at the same age his daughter had died. "I'm now 26 and working as a teacher," Rebecca read, approaching the letter's conclusion. "Every day, I work with children who are facing their own struggles, and I try to be the kind of person who helps them find hope, the way your music helped me find hope. I wanted you to know that your songs didn't just entertain me, they helped shape me into who I am today. When people ask me about my father, I tell them he was a hero who taught me that love is stronger than loss, and your music helped me understand what that really means." Rebecca looked up from the letter, her own eyes moist with emotion. She signs it. "With endless gratitude, Jennifer Patterson, P.S. I hope someday I can thank you in person for helping a 13-year-old girl find her way back to believing in tomorrow." The silence that followed was deafening. George sat motionless, staring at nothing, as 37 years of suppressed grief crashed over him like a tsunami. The name Jennifer, the age 13, the theme of loss and love and finding hope in the darkness. It was as if the universe had conspired to strip away every defense he'd built. "George?" Rebecca's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" But George Strait was not all right. For the first time in nearly 4 decades of public life, the man who had built his career on steady reliability, on being the dependable constant in an ever-changing industry, was falling apart on live television. The tears came first, not the controlled, dignified tears of a performer moved by a touching story, but the raw, ugly tears of a father who had never properly grieved his child. His shoulders began to shake, and then his entire body was convulsing with sobs that seemed to rise from the deepest places in his soul. "Jennifer," he whispered, and it wasn't clear whether he was addressing the letter writer or his daughter. "Oh God, Jennifer." The studio erupted in controlled chaos. Camera operators weren't sure whether to keep filming or cut away. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing something they'd never expected to see. Rebecca reached across the space between their chairs, placing a gentle hand on George's arm. "It's okay," she said softly, though her voice carried through the studio microphones to the television audience. "Take your time." But George couldn't take his time because he couldn't stop. 37 years of perfect self-control had shattered, and the grief that poured out was oceanic in its depth and power. He doubled over in his chair, one hand covering his face, the other gripping his chest as if trying to hold his heart together. "My daughter," he managed between sobs. "Her name was Jennifer. She was 13. She died in 1986. The words hung in the air like a confession, like a secret that had been kept so long it had become poison. Rebecca's eyes widened with understanding and compassion, realizing that her routine fan mail segment had accidentally triggered something profound and painful. In the control booth, producer Daniel Webster was frantically communicating with his director. They had protocols for technical difficulties, for medical emergencies, for celebrity misbehavior, but nothing in their playbook covered this level of raw, authentic human breakdown. "Do we cut to commercial?" the director asked through his headset. "Not yet," Daniel replied, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented and important. "This is real. This is what television should be." On screen, George continued to weep, the sound of his grief filling the studio and broadcasting into millions of homes across America. It was the sound of a wound that had never healed, of love that had nowhere to go, of a father's heart breaking over and over again across the span of decades. "She loved music," George whispered, his words barely audible but carried clearly by his microphone. "She loved life. She was going to change the world." Rebecca, tears now streaming down her own face, leaned forward in her chair. As a journalist, she knew she was witnessing something extraordinary, the moment when one of country music's most private figures accidentally revealed the source of both his greatest pain and his deepest artistic inspiration. "George," she said gently, "would you like us to take a break?" But George shook his head, even as the tears continued to fall. Something inside him had broken open, and after 37 years of carrying this burden alone, he couldn't seem to stop the words from coming. "Every song I've ever sung," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every performance, every album. It's all been for her. She'll never hear any of it. But it's all been for her." The studio remained in stunned silence as America watched the King of Country reveal the secret sorrow that had shaped his entire career. In living rooms and kitchens across the nation, people stopped what they were doing to witness this moment of complete vulnerability from a man they'd thought they knew. And in that moment, George Strait, who had spent 37 years being strong for everyone else, who had channeled his grief into a legendary career while keeping his deepest pain private, finally began the process of healing that should have started in 1986 but had been postponed by the demands of fame, responsibility, and the simple need to survive. The broadcast would eventually cut to commercial, but not before millions of viewers had seen something they would never forget. The moment when perfect professional composure gave way to perfect human truth, when the king of country's crown slipped to reveal the broken heart beneath, and when a letter from a stranger named Jennifer opened a door that had been locked for nearly 4 decades. The commercial break lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds, but for George Strait, it felt like a lifetime. He sat in the brightly lit studio, surrounded by concerned faces and hushed voices, trying to piece together what had just happened. His carefully constructed public persona had cracked open like an egg, spilling 37 years of grief across live television for the world to see. "George, we can stop here if you need to," Rebecca Thompson said, her hand still resting gently on his arm. Her own mascara had run slightly, evidence of how deeply the moment had affected her. "We have enough material to fill the show without continuing." But George shook his head, accepting the tissues offered by a production assistant with the care of someone handling fragile glass. "No, I need to finish this. I've started something here, and I owe it to that young woman who wrote the letter to finish it properly." Producer Daniel Webster approached cautiously, his usual television confidence replaced by genuine human concern. "Sir, with all due respect, you don't owe anyone anything. What just happened? That was incredibly brave, but you don't have to continue if you're not ready." George looked around the studio, taking in the faces of the crew members, the small studio audience, the cameras that had just broadcast his breakdown to millions of viewers. For the first time in decades, he felt completely exposed, but strangely it wasn't the terrifying experience he'd always imagined it would be. "How long do we have?" he asked, his voice stronger now, though still rough with emotion. 2 minutes until we're back live," the floor manager announced. George stood up, walked to the small makeup station at the edge of the set, and looked at himself in the mirror. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face blotchy from crying, his hair slightly mussed. He looked for the first time in decades, completely human rather than carefully polished. The image was jarring, but also somehow liberating. "Can we fix this?" he asked the makeup artist, a young woman named Ashley Martinez, who had been working in television for 8 years, but had never dealt with anything quite like this. "Mr. Strait," Ashley said gently, applying concealer under his eyes. "Honestly, you look more real right now than most people ever look on television. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people see you as you really are." As Ashley worked, George found himself thinking about Jennifer Patterson's letter, about the courage it had taken for a stranger to share her story of loss and healing. If a 26-year-old teacher from Missouri could be that brave, then maybe a 72-year-old country singer could find some courage too. 30 seconds, the floor manager called. George returned to his chair, straightening his shirt and taking a deep breath. Across from him, Rebecca was reviewing her notes, trying to figure out how to navigate the remainder of the interview. The usual promotional questions about tour dates and album sales seemed absurdly trivial now. "And we're back in 5, 4, 3, 2... The red light on the camera blinked on, and George found himself looking directly into the lens, speaking to an audience he couldn't see but could somehow feel. Millions of people who had just witnessed his most vulnerable moment. "We're back with George Strait on Music City today," Rebecca said, her voice gentle but professional. "George, first of all, thank you for sharing that moment with us. I think everyone watching understands that this was completely unexpected." George nodded, his hands clasped in his lap. "I want to apologize to your viewers for falling apart on your show. That wasn't what anyone tuned in to see." "Actually," Rebecca said, "I think it might have been exactly what some people needed to see. Can you tell us about Jennifer?" Your daughter? For a moment, George was quiet, gathering thoughts and memories he'd kept locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten how to access them. Jennifer Lynn Strait was born on October 6, 1972. She was 13 years old when she died in a car accident in San Marcos, Texas, on June 25, 1986. The facts came out clean and simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. In the studio, there wasn't a dry eye among the crew. She was... George paused, searching for words that could possibly contain the enormity of his daughter. She was everything good about the world wrapped up in one person. Smart, funny, kind. She wanted to be a veterinarian because she said animals deserved to have someone who really understood them. She was passionate about everything: school, her friends, horses, music. Did she like your music? George smiled for the first time since the breakdown, a genuine expression that transformed his face. She was my biggest fan and my toughest critic. She'd sit in on recording sessions sometimes, and if she didn't like a song, she'd tell me straight up. She had this way of cutting right to the truth of things. What happened that day in 1986? The question hung in the air, and George took a deep breath before answering. She was driving with some friends to San Marcos. They were going to spend the day at the river, just being kids. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head on. Jennifer and her friend Lisa Murphy were killed instantly. The other two girls survived with serious injuries. George's voice remained steady as he recounted the facts, but Rebecca could see the tremendous effort it was taking. How did you get through it? Honestly, I'm not sure I ever did get through it. I got around it, over it, under it. But I'm not sure I ever went through it the way you're supposed to. George looked directly into the camera again. Sarah, my wife, she wanted to talk about it, to grieve together, to get counseling. But I couldn't. I threw myself into work instead. Your career really took off in the late 80s. That wasn't a coincidence. Music became my way of surviving. Every song, every album, every tour, it was all a way of not having to sit still with the pain. And somehow, that grief, that love for Jennifer, it found its way into the music, even though I never talked about it directly. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Do you think Jennifer would have wanted you to handle it that way? The question clearly caught George off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, considering. No, he finally said. She would have wanted me to be honest about it. She would have wanted me to let people help. Jennifer never hid from anything in her life. She faced everything head on with this incredible courage. I think she would have been disappointed in how I handled losing her. But you're talking about it now. Yeah, I am, because of a letter from a young woman who shares her name and who was brave enough to tell the truth about her own pain. Sometimes it takes a stranger to show you what you've been too afraid to see. What would you want to say to Jennifer Patterson, the young woman who wrote the letter? George looked directly into the camera, and for the first time in the interview, his voice was completely steady and strong. Jennifer, if you're watching this, I want you to thank you. Your letter didn't just touch my heart. It opened a door I'd been afraid to walk through for 37 years. You showed me that survival isn't the same as healing, and that honoring someone's memory might mean being brave enough to talk about how much losing them hurt. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You said my music helped you when you were 13 and dealing with losing your father. Well, your letter helped me when I'm 72 and still dealing with losing my daughter. That's the power of sharing our stories, of being honest about our pain. It creates connections across time and space and circumstances. Or what about other people who might be watching, who have experienced similar losses? George considered the question carefully. I think I'd want them to know that grief doesn't have a timeline. It's been 37 years for me, and I'm just now beginning to really face it. There's no right way or wrong way to grieve, but there is such a thing as healthy grief versus grief that isolates you. He shifted in his chair, becoming more animated as he found his footing in this new territory of openness. For 37 years, I've been carrying this alone. I thought I was protecting my family, protecting my fans, protecting myself. But really, I was just scared. And fear makes everything harder than it has to be. Have you written songs about Jennifer over the years? Dozens, George admitted. Probably hundreds of bits and pieces, fragments of songs that I could never finish because they hurt too much to complete. There's a whole catalogue of music that's never been heard because I wasn't brave enough to let it see the light. Would you consider sharing some of those songs now? The question clearly surprised George. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. You know what? Maybe I would. Maybe it's time for those songs to serve their purpose, which was never just to help me process my grief, but to help other people process theirs. As the interview continued, something remarkable was happening both in the studio and across the country. Phone lines at the television station were lighting up with callers wanting to share their own stories of loss and healing. Social media was exploding with messages of support and shared experiences. The moment of vulnerability that George had feared would end his career was instead creating connections he'd never imagined possible. George, we're almost out of time, but I have to ask, what happens next? How do you move forward from this moment? George looked thoughtful, his hands now relaxed in his lap. I think I need to go home and have some conversations I should have had 37 years ago, with my wife, with my son, with myself, and maybe I need to visit Jennifer's grave and actually talk to her instead of just standing there in silence. Any final thoughts for our viewers? Just this, George said, looking directly into the camera one more time. Don't wait 37 years to be honest about your pain. Don't wait for a stranger's letter to give you permission to grieve. And don't underestimate the power of sharing your story. You never know whose life you might touch, whose heart you might help heal. As the show's closing music began to play, Rebecca reached across and shook George's hand. Thank you for trusting us with this moment. I think you've given people something truly special today. Thank you for creating the space for it to happen, George replied. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we never planned to have. The cameras stopped rolling, but the impact of what had just happened was only beginning to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The first indication that something extraordinary had happened came before George even left the studio. His phone, which he'd silenced during the taping, was buzzing with an intensity he'd never experienced. Text messages, missed calls, and social media notifications were flooding in faster than the device could process them. George, Thomas Mitchell said, approaching with his own phone in hand and a look of bewilderment on his face. The station's phone lines are completely jammed. Social media is going crazy. I've never seen anything like this. As they made their way through the hallways of the studio, staff members who had witnessed the broadcast approached with quiet words of support. Ashley, the makeup artist, stopped him near the exit. Mr. Strait, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I lost my brother in Iraq 3 years ago. He was 22. What you did today, it helped me realize I haven't been dealing with it either. Thank you. The drive to the airport was surreal. Thomas kept fielding calls from journalists, other television producers, and record label executives, all wanting to understand what had happened and what it might mean for George's career. But George himself seemed oddly calm, staring out the window at the Nashville landscape as if seeing it for the first time. Are you worried? Thomas asked as they pulled onto the highway. About what? About the reaction. About how this might affect your image, your tour sales, your... Thomas, George interrupted gently, for 37 years, I've been worried about protecting an image that was built on hiding the most important thing that ever happened to me. I'm tired of being worried. By the time they reached the private aviation terminal, the magnitude of the response was becoming clear. Thomas's assistant, Patricia Collins, met them at the plane with a tablet full of social media analytics and news reports. "The interview video is already trending on every platform," Patricia reported, her usual efficient demeanor tinged with amazement. "We're getting interview requests from major networks, documentary filmmakers, grief counselors, child psychologists. Everyone wants to talk to you." "What are people saying?" George asked. Patricia scrolled through her notes. "It's overwhelmingly positive. People are sharing their own stories of loss, thanking you for being vulnerable, saying they finally feel less alone. There's a hashtag trending, Jennifer Stories, where people are sharing memories of loved ones they've lost." As the plane lifted off from Nashville, George found himself thinking about Jennifer Patterson, the young woman whose letter had triggered everything. He wondered if she was watching, if she understood the chain reaction her simple act of courage had started. "Thomas," George said suddenly, "I want to do something. Can you find out how to contact Jennifer Patterson, the one who wrote the letter?" "Of course. What did you have in mind?" "I want to thank her properly, and I want to ask her something." The flight back to Texas passed quickly, with George alternating between reading the messages flooding his phone and staring out at the landscape below. Among the hundreds of comments and messages, several stood out. "My daughter died in a car accident when she was 16. I've never been able to talk about it. Watching you today made me realize I need help. Michael Thompson, Oklahoma. I'm 13 years old and my mum died last year. Your music helps me feel less alone, and seeing you cry today helped me realize it's okay for me to cry too. Sarah Williams, Kentucky. I've been a fan for 40 years, but I've never respected you more than I do right now. Real courage isn't hiding your pain, it's sharing it." Linda Rodriguez, California. Each message was a reminder that his moment of breakdown had somehow become a moment of connection, that his vulnerability had given others permission to be vulnerable too. When the plane touched down in San Antonio, Sarah was waiting in the terminal. She'd driven down from the ranch after watching the broadcast, her face a mixture of concern, pride, and something that looked like relief. "How are you?" she asked as they embraced, and George could hear the weight of 37 years in the question. "I'm different," George said honestly. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for decades, and I can finally exhale." The drive back to Cotulla was quiet, both of them processing what had happened and what it might mean for their family, their marriage, their future. They'd built their life together around carefully avoiding certain topics, navigating around the Jennifer-shaped hole in their hearts with the skill of people who'd had decades to practice. "Sarah," George said as they turned onto the ranch road, "we need to talk. Really talk about Jennifer, about how we've handled losing her, about how we can do better." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not the desperate tears of fresh grief, but the relieved tears of someone who'd been waiting 37 years for this conversation. "I've been hoping you'd say that for so long." That evening, they sat on their porch as the sun set over the Texas hills, and for the first time since 1986, they talked about their daughter. Not around her, not despite her absence, but about her, her laugh, her dreams, her terrible jokes, her fierce independence, her overwhelming love for everything and everyone in her orbit. "Do you remember," Sarah said, "how she used to rearrange the furniture in her room every few months because she said the energy needed to flow differently?" George laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse when it came to Jennifer memories. "And how she'd make us all sit in specific chairs at dinner because she'd read that the placement affected family harmony. She was so wise for 13. Sometimes I think she knew things the rest of us hadn't figured out yet." They talked until well past midnight, sharing memories they'd kept locked away, crying together for the first time since the funeral, and slowly beginning the process of healing that should have started decades earlier. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything even further. Thomas had tracked down Jennifer Patterson's contact information, and she'd agreed to a phone conversation with George. "Mr. Strait?" Jennifer Patterson's voice was warm and slightly nervous. "I can't believe this is happening. I watched your interview yesterday, and I'm so sorry about your daughter." "Jennifer," George said, "I'm the one who needs to thank you. Your letter gave me something I didn't even know I needed, the courage to finally talk about her." "I've been reading all the stories people are sharing online," Jennifer said. "It's incredible how many people have been carrying grief they've never talked about. You've started something really important. That's actually why I wanted to call you. I have an idea, but I need to ask you something first. Would you be willing to help me with a project? Something that could help other people the way your letter helped me?" "Of course. What did you have in mind?" George took a deep breath, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "I want to create a foundation, the Jennifer Strait Foundation, focused on helping people, especially young people, deal with grief and loss. But I don't want it to be just another charity that writes checks. I want it to be about connection, about people sharing their stories, about using music and art and community to help people heal." Jennifer Patterson was quiet for a moment. "That sounds amazing. But why do you need me?" "Because you understand something I'm just learning. That healing happens when people have the courage to share their truth. I want you to help me design programs that encourage that kind of courage. Will you consider it?" "Mr. Strait." "George." "Yes. Absolutely yes." As the conversation continued, George found himself energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Jennifer's death, he had a sense of purpose that went beyond just surviving, beyond just maintaining his career. He had a way to honor his daughter's memory that felt worthy of the person she'd been and the person she would have become. Over the following weeks, the responses to his television breakdown continued to pour in. Other celebrities began sharing their own stories of hidden grief. Grief counselors reported increases in people seeking help. Support groups found themselves with waiting lists as people who'd been suffering in silence finally reached out for help. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from his son Marcus, who drove down from San Antonio 3 days after the broadcast. "Dad," Marcus said as they stood in Jennifer's room, which had remained essentially unchanged since 1986. "I need to tell you something. I've been angry at you for 37 years. George felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to listen. "I was angry because you shut down after Jennifer died. You became this perfect public figure, but at home, you just disappeared. Mom and I were grieving too, but we had to grieve alone because you couldn't talk about it." The words hit hard, but George recognized their truth. "I'm sorry, son. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really just protecting myself. But watching you on television, seeing you finally break down, I realized something. You weren't hiding because you didn't care. You were hiding because you cared so much it was killing you. And I've been doing the same thing, hiding from my grief by being angry at you for hiding from yours." Father and son stood in Jennifer's room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life cut short. Her horse show ribbons, her collection of veterinary journals, the guitar George had bought her for her 13th birthday. And for the first time in decades, they grieved together. "I want to help with the foundation," Marcus said. "I'm a doctor. I understand trauma and grief from a medical perspective. And I think Jennifer would want our family to be part of healing other families." That night, as George sat at his kitchen table working on plans for the Jennifer Strait Foundation, he felt something he hadn't experienced since 1986. Hope. Not just hope for his own healing, but hope that his daughter's brief life and tragic death could somehow become a source of comfort and connection for others walking similar paths. Outside, The Texas stars shone with the same brilliance they'd had on the night Jennifer was born, and for the first time in 37 years, George looked up at them and smiled. 6 months after the interview that changed everything, George Strait stood before a crowd of 300 people gathered in the community center of Springfield, Missouri, Jennifer Patterson's hometown. It was the first official event of the Jennifer Strait Foundation, and the energy in the room was unlike anything he'd experienced in 5 decades of performing. The foundation had grown organically from that initial conversation with Jennifer Patterson, evolving into something more comprehensive and meaningful than either of them had initially imagined. Working with grief counselors, child psychologists, and community organizers, they developed a series of programs that combined music therapy, storytelling workshops, and peer support groups to help people of all ages process loss and trauma. "Welcome to the first Jennifer Strait Foundation Healing Circle," George said into the microphone, his voice steady but warm. "6 months ago, I thought I had my grief under control. I thought 37 years of keeping it private meant I had dealt with it. I was wrong." The audience, a mix of grieving parents, teenagers who'd lost friends or family members, elderly people dealing with the deaths of spouses, and community members who simply wanted to support their neighbors, listened with the intensity of people who understood pain firsthand. "My daughter Jennifer died when she was 13. And for 37 years, I let that loss define me by what I couldn't do. Couldn't talk about her, couldn't visit certain places, couldn't listen to certain songs. Today, I want to talk about what we can do with our grief, how we can transform it from something that isolates us into something that connects us." He gestured to Jennifer Patterson, who was sitting in the front row wearing a Jennifer Strait Foundation t-shirt and a nervous smile. "This young woman taught me that healing begins when we find the courage to share our stories. So today, that's what we're going to do." The format they developed was simple but powerful. People were invited to share a memory of someone they'd lost, not focusing on the death itself, but on what made that person special. Music played a central role. Sometimes live performances by local musicians, sometimes recordings that held special meaning, sometimes just the rhythm of shared silence. The first person to speak was Margaret Chen, a 68-year-old woman who'd lost her husband of 45 years to cancer the previous spring. "Robert loved to garden," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Every morning, he'd get up before dawn and spend an hour with his tomatoes and roses, talking to them like they were old friends. After he died, I couldn't bear to go into the backyard. But last week I realized Robert wouldn't want his garden to die because he did, so I started talking to the tomatoes just like he did, and you know what? They listened." The laughter that rippled through the room was gentle and understanding, the kind that acknowledges both pain and the possibility of joy. One by one, people began sharing their stories. A teenager named Michael talked about his best friend who died in a swimming accident. A young mother named Lisa shared memories of her stillborn daughter. An elderly man named Frank spoke about his brother who died in Vietnam 50 years earlier. "I never told anyone this before," Frank said, his weathered hands gripping the microphone, "but Tommy was supposed to go to Vietnam instead of me. We flipped a coin and I lost, or I thought I lost. Tommy said he'd go anyway, said I had a better chance of making it home because I was smarter. He died 3 weeks before the end of his tour, and I've carried the guilt of that coin flip for 50 years. The silence that followed was profound, not empty but full of collective understanding. George found himself thinking about survivors' guilt, about the arbitrary nature of loss, about how many people were carrying secrets that were slowly poisoning them. As the afternoon progressed, something magical began to happen. The stories started connecting to each other, creating a web of shared experience that transformed individual pain into collective strength. A woman who'd lost her mother to Alzheimer's connected with a man whose father had died the same way. Parents who'd lost children found each other across the room. Veterans who'd lost brothers in arms recognized something in each other's eyes. Jennifer Patterson stood up near the end of the session, her voice clear and strong. "I want to read something," she said. "It's a letter I never sent, written to my father on the 10th anniversary of his death." She unfolded a piece of paper, worn from being carried and reread countless times. "Dear Dad, I'm 23 today, 10 years older than I was when you died. I wanted to tell you about the woman I've become, about how your love shaped me even after you were gone. I'm a teacher now, working with kids who remind me every day that the future is possible, that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I used to be angry that you left, but now I understand that you didn't leave. Love doesn't leave, it just changes form. Your love became my strength, your memory became my motivation, your sacrifice became my purpose. I carry you with me every day, not as a burden, but as a gift." When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. George stood up and walked over to her, and without saying a word, they hugged, two people whose shared understanding of loss had created something beautiful and healing. "This is what the Jennifer Strait Foundation is about," George said, addressing the room one final time. "It's about understanding that grief is not something to get over, but something to get through. It's about recognizing that the love we carry for those we've lost can become a force for healing in the world." He paused, looking around the room at faces that had been transformed over the course of the afternoon. People who'd arrived looking isolated and alone were now exchanging contact information, making plans to stay connected, creating the kind of community that could sustain them through the ongoing process of grief and healing. "My daughter Jennifer would be 51 years old today if she'd lived," George continued. "I'll never know what she would have accomplished, what dreams she would have pursued, what impact she would have had on the world. But I've learned something important. Her impact doesn't have to end with her death. Every person we help, every story we share, every moment of connection we create is a way of extending her life, of letting her love continue to ripple outward into the world." As the official program ended and people began to mingle, George found himself in conversations unlike any he'd had in his professional life. These weren't fans wanting autographs or industry professionals discussing business. These were human beings sharing the most important parts of themselves, trusting him with their pain because he'd been brave enough to share his own. A teenage girl named Amanda approached him near the end of the evening. "Mr. Strait," she said, "my little brother died in a car accident 2 years ago. He was 8. I haven't been able to talk about it because everyone says I need to be strong for my parents. But listening to you today, I realized that being strong doesn't mean not crying." George knelt down so he was at eye level with her. "Amanda, crying is one of the strongest things you can do. It means you love someone so much that losing them changed you forever. That's not weakness. That's the most powerful force in the universe." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and George knew that this moment of connection, this permission to grieve, this validation of love, was exactly what Jennifer would have wanted her legacy to be. Later that evening, George, Sarah, and Marcus sat in their hotel room processing the day. The foundation had exceeded their wildest expectations, with requests for healing circles pouring in from communities across the country. But more than the organizational success, the day had represented something profound for their family. "Dad," Marcus said, "I want to tell you something. Watching you today, seeing how you connected with those people. That's the father I remember from before Jennifer died. Not the perfect performer, not the careful public figure, but the man who could make anyone feel seen and understood. Sarah reached over and took George's hand. "Jennifer would be so proud," she said simply, "not just of the foundation, but of who you've become in the process of creating it." That night, George stood on the hotel balcony looking out at the lights of Springfield, Missouri, thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had taken a letter from a stranger, a moment of public vulnerability, and the courage to finally talk about the most important loss of his life, to discover that his greatest professional achievement wasn't any of his 61 albums or his decades of sold-out concerts. His greatest achievement was learning to transform grief into connection, pain into purpose, and the love he carried for his daughter into a force for healing in the world. The next morning, as they prepared to return to Texas, George received a call from Christopher Reynolds, his longtime friend and guitarist. "George," Christopher said, "I've been thinking about what you said months ago, about having songs you'd written about Jennifer that you'd never shared. Would you consider recording them?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The idea of making those private songs public still felt daunting, but George realized his relationship with vulnerability had fundamentally changed. "You know what, Chris? I think I would, but not as a commercial album, as something to share at the healing circles, something that might help other people find words for their own grief." "That sounds perfect." As their plane lifted off from Missouri, George looked down at the community where the foundation's work had officially begun and felt something he hadn't experienced in 37 years: complete peace with Jennifer's memory. She was no longer a source of pain to be avoided, but a source of strength to be shared. The Jennifer Strait Foundation would go on to help thousands of people over the following years, creating communities of healing in dozens of cities, developing innovative approaches to grief therapy, and proving that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from forgetting our losses, but from learning to carry them with grace and purpose. And in a recording studio in Nashville 6 months later, George Strait would finally sing the songs he'd written for his daughter, simple, honest ballads about a 13-year-old girl who'd loved life so completely that her brief time on earth had created ripples of love and healing that would continue long after anyone alive could remember her laugh. But perhaps the most important outcome of the entire journey was the simplest. For the first time since 1986, when George Strait thought about his daughter Jennifer, he smiled before he cried. And sometimes, especially during the healing circles when he watched strangers become friends through shared grief and mutual support, he smiled without crying at all. The King of Country had lost his crown in a moment of televised vulnerability, only to discover that the man beneath it, the father, the husband, the human being who'd learned to transform grief into grace, was far more valuable than any title the music industry could bestow. And every night, as he looked up at the Texas stars that had watched over his family through triumph and tragedy, George Strait knew that Jennifer was still there, not as a source of pain, but as a guiding light illuminating the path from loss to love, from isolation to connection, from surviving to truly living. The end of his story wasn't about getting over grief. It was about getting through it and helping others do the same. It was about understanding that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to express itself in the world. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, that love becomes a foundation upon which others can build their own healing, their own hope, their own understanding that even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone.